The war in Ukraine continues, although we're still enveloped in the fog of war and it's impossible to ascertain the particulars about exactly what's happening on the ground, at least if one only listens to the yellow journalism of the world's state dependent press. Continuing our discussion of the Ukraine conflict, we're joined by Professor Salim Mansur, who urges us to stand back from the prevailing narrative and take in the big picture historically to get a better understanding of this conflict. Now, in recent conversation with Salim, we discussed one aspect of what seems to be a perpetual cycle of war and peace, and that is the influence of the neocons. Now, the neocons is a loose group of thinkers and political advisors who, since at least the 1960s, have perpetuated a worldview that America, apart from Israel, is the only moral nation on earth, and it must be in a constant state of war readiness to act as the constabulary in a monopolar world. But more on that later. I'd like to begin, however, by quoting from a June 26th tweet that came from the Russian embassy in the UK and get your thoughts on it, Celine, perhaps in light of our private discussions on the monopolar globalist agenda of the US, the EU, and the United Nations. And I'm quoting from the tweet here. It starts off, President Putin, and they're quoting him. Today, as never before, the world needs BRICS countries' leadership in defining a unifying and positive course for forming a truly multipolar system of interstate relations based on universal norms of international law and key principles of the UN Charter, unquote. And of course, BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, Communist China, and South Africa. Your thoughts on that tweet, Salim?
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for, again, opening up this discussion, this very important and vital discussion. We are past the fourth month of the special military operation that began in Ukraine on February the 24th. So here we are at the end of June. And what you're reading, the message coming out of Moscow about this struggle or this fight that is taking place is, in a sense, about bringing to an end the unipolar ambitions of the Americans. And you have mentioned neocons, and we're going to talk about that and get into it, as you say, a little later, and restoring a multipolar world. I believe we are at a hinge moment in history. This war that began, this unfortunate war in terms of the loss of life, casualties, and the destruction that has taken place, and possibly more is to come before there is an eventual ceasefire and end to the war in some form of negotiation that we can only speculate at this moment. But the facts of the matter on the ground is that the narrative that the Western media, the American, Canadian, and the British media in particular have carried is that Russia, Putin, invaded a sovereign country, crossed the international borders of Ukraine, and has engaged in an aggression against a sovereign country that was seeking membership in the European Union. And the Americans, prior to that, had been talking about, both publicly and privately, about Ukraine joining NATO, as the boundaries of NATO were moving eastward since the end of the Cold War. So that is the narrative that has been spun. And in that context, Putin is modern reincarnation of Hitler or Genghis Khan, or whatever is the image that the Western media wants to create. And the design of Putin, the reincarnate Hitler, or Stalin, is the restoration of the former Soviet Union. And this war in Ukraine is a proof of that design. But that is not backed by evidence. And we have talked about that in the past. Just quickly refresh the memory. This war came about, it was a war in which Putin preempted what was expected, what was anticipated, what was happening. That is the escalation of the Kiev regime, the Ukrainian nationalist regime, engaging in the military operation, internal military operation against the Ukrainian Russian population, Russian ethnic population in the Donbass region, that is Eastern Ukraine, Ukraine bordering on the Russian frontier. And that sort of military engagement had been taking place since 2014, the Maidan coup that ousted the elected president, who was, in terms of the spectrum of internal Ukrainian politics, was in a sense pro-Russian. That is, President Yanukovych, Viktor Yanukovych, was ousted, and Poroshenko, who was a Ukrainian nationalist, was installed in office. And following that, there has been a constant military aggression. In effect, a sort of internal ethnic genocide that was designed and taking place. And in the context of that was also the whole issue of Ukraine becoming a member of NATO, or at least that was what was on the table, the discussion. This was a dagger drawn at the throat of the Russian government, Moscow. I mean, we have talked about the perfect analogy here is the one with the Cuban Missile Crisis. No American government would accept and tolerate any foreign power using any of the Caribbean island, as Cuba is a Caribbean island, or any of the other Caribbean island as a platform for military purpose against United States, or threatening United States, whether it is Mexico, whether it was Cuba, and so on and so forth. I mean, can you imagine in the modern context, China making agreement with Grenada, and Grenada was, in that sense, invaded by President Reagan in the 1980s, making an agreement with Grenada to establish in Grenada a base for Chinese operation. I mean, there would be no question. It would be immediately eliminated, as was the case in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so advancing NATO boundaries right to the doorstep of Moscow was totally unacceptable by Putin or by any president of Russian Federation. And in the case of Putin, he had been in as many different ways, diplomatically, in the public, in conferences such as the Munich Security Conference in 2007, had been laying down what is the red line for Russia in terms of NATO's expansion eastward. And the red line was Ukraine and is Ukraine. And those warnings or considerations were all on the table. However, the Americans deliberately chose not only to ignore it, but to humiliate Moscow. After the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia went through an immense internal disorder, chaos, anarchy, pillage and plunder of its economy by both internal forces led by Russian oligarchs and by international players in taking advantage of Russian weakness. And so for the past 2 decades under Putin, there has been an effort to regain Russia's sovereignty and place in terms of the European nation states, European security order. And those have all been under discussion. But this advancement of NATO was the triggering effect. And that's what led the war. Let me just quote here as we go forward. In 2019, President Trump was impeached. And that impeachment, though it failed in the Senate, in the trial, but the indictment that was brought against President Trump to remove him from office was a phone call that the president had made to the newly elected president of Ukraine, who's the current president, Volodymyr Zelensky. And in that phone call, he had discussed or asked Zelensky to keep him informed, that is President Trump informed, about what measures that the government of Ukraine was going to take in the case of what was now publicly known, the manner in which the current president, President Biden, and his son were involved with this oil and gas corporation, Burisma, a Ukrainian oil and gas corporation, and its oligarch, Igor Kolomoisky, who had basically put Hunter Biden on the board for the oldest policy, pay to play favor. And President Trump asked for their information. These were all produced in the public. And he was impeached for that phone call, that he was using a foreign government to investigate his political opponent domestically. And the lead of congressmen in the Democratic team that came to the Senate in the trial, in his opening remarks in the impeachment, Adam Schiff made this observation right at the beginning of the presentation. People have forgotten that. So let me recall those words. This is what Adam Schiff said as the meeting began, the trial began. He said, "The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here." This is Nancy Pelosi. This is Adam Schiff. This is the Democratic Party of Biden.
It's an admission. It is an admission of the proxy war that we keep talking about.
Precisely. So this is what I wanted to recall. And so there is the narrative that Russia invaded Ukraine is an aggression, and therefore the resistance to that aggression and reversal of that aggression is what America is involved in this war. But basically, this is a proxy war that the Americans are waging against Russia, and that opens up the question, why?
How is this multipolar world that Putin is trying to maintain a benefit to us here in the West? You would think that us as Canadians, as part of this America hegemony, would want to be part of this American hegemony because, morally speaking, the West favors individual rights more than the East ever has. Russia is not necessarily what we would say is to be a free nation. Communist China, the exact opposite of a free nation. So why would you be in favor of a multipolar world?
Putin has spoken recently. There was a conference last week. It was the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, attended by countries that are from basically the South, India, Brazil, South Africa, many of the other African states, and so on, and also former republics of the Soviet Union that are now independent and sovereign states like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, and so on, including China. And there he spoke about the multipolar world and putting in place an alternative model or arrangement in terms of international trade and in terms of restoring the whole principle behind the UN Charter, as in contrast to what the Americans have been talking about for the past 30 years since the end of the Cold War, the liberal-based order. The liberal-based order is the American view of the world, or a new view of the world that they want to impose upon the world. And that is where, in the shorthand term, as you have used the word, globalism is about. I mean, it is the Americans will write the liberal order, the rule-based order, and the rest of the world will have to follow it, or there would be penalty. And that is not what the UN Charter is. That's not what the UN arrangement is, as was agreed upon and established at the end of World War II, 1945. So Putin, ironically, and the Chinese, and of course the Indians and the Brazilians and the South Africans, and I think the numbers will increase over the time, are saying no to the liberal rule-based order, that is, in which none of these countries are participating, but they're being told that you have to accept these rules. That means, it is not something that is negotiated. It is not something in which, the other parties, whether you agree with them in terms of their values or you don't, it is a negotiation that then sets together what will be the rules of operation in the world. And that was what the UN Charter is all about. That was settled. Now, the UN Charter, it can be argued that it needs some ways of updating. We are not living in the world of 1945 anymore in the context of when the UN Charter was signed. And at that time, the European colonial powers were still effectively in control, though they were losing control. That's another discussion, but they were effectively in control of most of the world, Africa, and whole chunks of Asia. That the British Empire was still there, the French Empire was there, the Spanish, the Portuguese, and so on and so forth. And we are in the 21st century, some 80 years later. The world is a much different place. There's 193 or 95 sovereign states, technically sovereign states in the world. And we need, in some ways, to update it. And one of the update that is mostly discussed, but there is no consensus and no agreement upon it, but it keeps coming up repeatedly, is the distribution of veto power at the Security Council. In effect, the United Nations is a two-chamber, as there is in any federation. There is the upper chamber, the Senate, and then there is the House of Commons. So the General Assembly is analogous to the House of Commons, where every single country in the world is assembled as sovereign independent state, and each country has one vote. But the upper chamber, the Security Council, constitutes of, at the moment, 15 members. 5 of them are permanent members who have the veto power. And the rest, the 10 other members, non-permanent members, are rotating members that are elected on the basis of regional representation by the members of the General Assembly. Canada's have very frequently been elected by the regional members of North America, of the Americas. And so we have a seat, North Americans have a seat, or the Western Hemisphere have a seat, I believe 2 seats in the Security Council among the non-permanent member. And at the present, I think it is Brazil is one of the member, and it escapes me who is the other member. So to update that, to either expand the veto powers or to limit how much the veto powers can use the veto, how many times they can use before it is exhausted and they can't use it anymore. So those are matters of discussion. But whatever will be the outcome of that discussion, eventually, if there is an outcome negotiated, it will be something in which the world will participate, and then the world will come to a consensus and an agreement and sign on to it. So that is the basis of international law coming out of an international organization, which every actor or participant accepts as the end result if that happens. Whereas, excuse me, the new liberal rule-based order simply comes out of the head of the American power and its allies, and that then is going to be imposed upon the rest of the world. And in some ways, that is the neocon agenda. Now, the organizations through which this liberal rule-based order is going to be imposed, brought about, the platform for this rule-based order, which is American-based order, is NATO. And we have seen the operation of NATO in the period after the end of the Cold War. That is, NATO has gone into operation in different parts of the world, the greater Middle East, the Balkans, and extending it closer and closer to the Russian border frontier, into operation, bringing about regime change or trying to provoke regime change, as happened in Libya, as happened in Bosnia, in Serbia with Kosovo. And these were done without the authorization of the United Nations Security Council. So these were done unilaterally by the power of the United States, and the power of the United States exercised through NATO with the support of the NATO members, of which Canada is a member of NATO, and so NATO, in effect, was running and has been running a security operation, regime change operation, as a parallel to the United Nations. Well, that is what has come into collision now over the Ukraine war. That is, the push for regime change, and we saw the effect of regime change that was done in Ukraine in 2014. It was attempted in 2005 also, when President Viktor Yanukovych was elected, who was more a pro-EU member, Ukrainian, was elected, and Viktor Yanukovych was defeated. But then Viktor Yanukovych came back in the election of 2010, or the candidate came back. He won the election, but a regime change was then put into effect, brought about the 2014 Maidan uprising, and then followed by a coup, which drove Viktor Yanukovych out of office. And that was, in a sense, managed by and organized by the neocons in Washington. I mean, these are all on record. In the case of 1914, it's on record. People heard the tape. People saw the documentary or films in the sense that documents what happened in Maidan Square. And you had the American Assistant Secretary of State in the Obama regime. This is 2014. Obama is the president. Victoria Nuland in effect, with the American ambassador in Kiev, in Ukraine. The name escapes me now of the American ambassador, but the American ambassador and Victoria Nuland were seen directing right on the ground the operation in Maidan Square, and Victoria Nuland was caught on tape when the discussion was going about what would be the opinion of the EU members and what do they have to say on this matter, and she basically said, and this is on tape, "F the EU," and the thing was carried out. So, of course, this is in the backyard of Russia. They are following it. They're seeing what is happening. And what the message then, what you read, what is coming out, what we are following now is Russia has taken, that is, Putin has taken the leadership as a result of the Ukraine war to say no to the rule-based order, that we are going to restore and we are going to maintain international law as a basis of conducting world affairs, that is through the United Nations. And the arrangements that had taken place after 1945, the system that had emerged in which America was the dominant player and a dominant power, the Bretton Woods arrangement for international trade and monetary arrangement, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and so on, that now the Russians, the Chinese, the Brazilians, the Indian, the BRIC nation that you mentioned, and others who are joining it are saying, we're going to discuss what will be the alternatives to this arrangement that in effect gives predominant power to the Washington cabal, Washington with its allies, particularly in NATO and through the EU, to impose their views upon the rest of the world, whether it is financial agreements, whether it is trade agreements, whether it's climate change agreements, and so on and so forth. And alternative to the use or the basis of international trade, that is the US dollar, king dollar, that is the international reserve currency. Well, what happened just before with the beginning of the military operation on February 24th, Russia was faced with, again, led by Washington, that's the Biden administration, with full support from NATO and EU, in a full spectrum sanction. No engagement with Russia. Russian exports will all be banned in the international arena. And to bring about that effect, Russia was removed from SWIFT, the mechanism through which international trade is done on the basis of US dollar account. And so in doing that, also, Russia's sovereign wealth in US dollar account was seized, or you put it more crudely, simply stolen, pocketed away. So here you have a sovereign country engaging in international trade and world affairs, was simply cancel culture. This was a cancel of the whole country. Cancel the whole country out from participating in international economy, international finance, in trade, and so on. So what was the response from Russia? President Biden said, when he did all of this thing in February and escalated it and imposed it upon the European Union, or the European Union went along with it, given the fact that the European Union is hugely dependent upon the resources imported from Russia, particularly oil and gas. Europe has no oil and gas of its own to meet its own demand. Countries like, especially the powerhouse of European Union, Germany, and they cut it off. They sanctioned it, and Biden said that we are going to reduce the Russian ruble into rubble. Well, 5 months later, 4 months later, into 5 months, 120 days later, we're going on. Instead of the ruble turning to rubble, Robert, it's just been the opposite. And how did that happen? Well, the Russian economy is based upon the wealth of its natural resources. Oil and gas is one. But there is a whole spectrum of commodities that is desperately needed in the world, particularly food grain. Russia is the largest exporter of food grain to the world, including Ukraine. But Russia is right on the top. It is the number one exporter of wheat. Canada is there among the top 5 countries. There is Canada, there is United States, but Russia is right up there, number 1. Then metals of all sorts that is absolutely vital in our modern economy, from iron and coal to, titanium and plutoniums and uraniums and all of the other precious metals that are needed. Lumber, water. And so the countries that need it, they will reach out to Russia. And Putin said that we will supply you these things, provided you buy them in ruble account. No more dollar account, because, we have been canceled out of the international market based on dollar currency. So you got to engage with us. If you want it, you can buy it with ruble accounts. So India, as an example, turns around and as of the latest information that I have seen, almost 40% of India's energy need has now coming from Russia. India has flipped and is taking in from Russia to meet its requirement. And India has gone into buying the rubles to pay for Russian gas. Out of the dollar economy, buying the rubles to make the trade. Same thing is happening with Brazil. Same thing is happening with African nations. Same thing is happening, most importantly, by China. So the entire mechanism of sanction to turn the Russian ruble into rubble, to starve the Russian people, to destroy the Russian economy, and that is what sanction is all about. It's pure unilateralism, has boomerang back on the United States, the European Union, and the NATO member states. That's exactly what Putin is talking about. And Putin is not alone in it. Well, Putin is leading the discussion, as happened in St. Petersburg International Forum. Right now, this again, over the weekend, or leading into the weekend, after the St. Petersburg Forum, was the meeting called in China, in Beijing, by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO. This is now another multilateral organization that has come into shape as China is pushing its policy of Belt and Road Initiative across the world. And so the people are meeting over there and they're discussing exactly these very issue. So put it in a capsule. What has happened is the Ukraine war has energized South and South cooperation, the global South, they have come together. They have basically rejected the Washington policy. Biden is now running around. He's recently gone to Saudi Arabia, or is going to Saudi Arabia. He's trying to meet with the Indians. He met with the Brazilians, the Mexicans. But they basically have rejected, in so many ways. They have to maintain relations with the United States, because the United States is still the superpower, and nobody wants to cut relationship with the United States. But it is with the Biden administration, it is with the neocon set of argument. They are basically rejecting it. They're not going together. And the BRICS nation, just take those 5 nations, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus other nations are joining it, like Mexico, some of the Middle Eastern states. But BRICS, for what it stands for, you put them together, they are almost, 3/4 of the world economy and population. You take China and India together, it's more than 1/3 of the world's population. And if you take their economy together, not on the basis of dollar account, that is GDP, but on the basis of PPP, that is purchasing power parity, the economy is almost 50% of the world economy, close to anywhere between 40 and 50% of the world economy. Add to that Russia. Russia is a powerhouse in terms of oil and gas and all the other commodities. The world has now, in effect, saying no to this dominance that has been for the past 80 years. And they were willing to go along with it, so long the Americans respected the basis on which the arrangements were made, that is, to the United Nations. But the neocon agenda has been to strip that away and to impose it, So you might want to ask, what is this neocon arrangement, and what is it that led to this situation that we find ourselves in? And of course, you ask also the question about Canada. Well, Canada is right in to use the metaphor, a biblical metaphor, if I don't mangle it, misspeak it. Canada is the Jonah inside the belly of the beast, the whale, which is the neocon arrangement. We have talked about this. We are not a sovereign country. We are a vassal state. So Canada is, in that sense, taken for granted. We have not staked out our position based upon our national interest. To do that, we would have to define what is our national interest, but we have never defined it. And we have simply gone along with the mother country, Britain, or now since 1945 with the United States. So Canada is taken for granted. Nobody particularly pay attention to Canada. Neither does anybody pay attention to Australia and New Zealand, especially in the coming world, because they are
interesting, Salim, is that it doesn't seem to matter what administration or who's in power in the United States. These neocons have driven policy since, as you say, since post Second World War, but more, I guess, tangibly in the 60s, and have driven the perpetual war machine of the military industrial complex, regardless if it's Biden or Trump or Bush or Obama, or it doesn't matter who is in power, Kennedy, Eisenhower. They still have this worldview which is perpetuating war in a sort of a Trotskyite fashion of a perpetual revolution. Perpetual. What was that one quote that you sent me? Perpetual war brings perpetual peace, something like that. This is their worldview, and it seems to be going on behind the scenes of what you and I would recognize to be the actual people in power. They're puppets. Or if they're not puppets, they're willingly accepting the advice of these neocons. And I would just direct our viewers, if they want to know a little bit more about it, to have a look at a document that you sent me called Rebuilding America's Defenses. Strategy, Forces, and Resources for a New Century, a report of the Project for the New American Century back in 2000. And if you Google that, you'll find it on archive.org, readily available. It's about 98 pages long. And it outlines, more or less, the philosophy. I wouldn't necessarily call it an ideology, but a philosophy of taking the United States as the moral exemplar of the world and ironically, in an un-American way, perpetuating war throughout the planet to keep it at a stage of war readiness. Not just war readiness against, say, for example, a Soviet Union or a Russia, but on two fronts. They have the worldview that the United States, being the power that it is, the moral authority of the world, that it must be ready to battle a two-front war, perhaps Russia and Communist China at the same time. In other words, they're not holding back any punches, and they're willing to spend a huge amount of GDP, destroy millions of lives throughout the world, destabilize economies and countries in order to put the United States, and to a lesser extent Israel, which is also complicit in all this worldview of the neocons, at the pinnacle of a movement that the rest of the world doesn't seem to want to bow down to. And this is what we're seeing played out now in the Ukraine with Russia. He knows about it. Look at the words of that tweet from the Russian embassy in the UK. He knows about it. The multipolar versus unipolar, international law versus the unilateral law of the liberal agenda of the West. So he knows what he's talking about when he puts out these tweets. And it's fascinating when you're calling me up and telling me about all these things that I don't see this anywhere in the media. All we see as the peons of the world is the superficiality. Russia, bad guy, invades Ukraine, good guy, therefore we must help. Yeah, but let's stand back. Let's go up to 35,000 feet and look down at the history of what's going on and who's pulling whose little strings and why we're in this situation. And I have to thank you for it. It's the neocons. I didn't know anything about them. I'd heard the term before, and I'd known some of the players, but people should familiarize themselves with people like, the late now, Donald Kagan and his son. Donald Kagan, professor who just died last year, I believe. Look up some of the videos on YouTube because he's there as well. Not YouTube, CPAC has a couple of videos of his, and where he's outlining this whole strategy. And they're in the White House, they're in the Oval Office, telling the presidents in their ear, because most presidents don't know what's going on. They're not grand philosophers or people who can see the big picture, or historians. They rely on people like the Donald Kagans, the neocons, to tell them how things are in the world, and they just go along. Is that a correct assessment?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it is. I think, in some sense, urgent that we have that discussion, and maybe we should revisit this topic because it is a topic in itself. It needs an exploration in the context of what transpired in America. I mean, if I have some reservation to your initial observation, it is that Kennedy or Eisenhower or Reagan, they were neocons or not. And I mean, that needs to be discussed. But my view or response is that they were not. This is a issue, and we have raised this issue, or you have raised it, and I'm coming back to it in the context of the Ukraine war. That all of this has now, in a sense, been exposed. The weight has come down. The media, of course, in North America and in the Anglosphere, is no longer the media that we have expected our media to be based on our devotion and our own instinctive struggle to maintain freedom as the basis of conducting our affairs, whether it is personal affairs, private affairs, or public affairs, transparency, open, freedom, respect of the other, and so on,
But
which means,
the reason why, Salim, I bring up Kennedy and Eisenhower, perhaps it's a bit of a Freudian thing, because those two presidents warned us about the military-industrial complex. They told us
fair
that
enough.
there's this machine in the background that is going to be used or can be used for evil. And they were right, and that's what happened. These neocons, this loose group of intellectuals, took over the military-industrial complex and used it for their own worldview.
Yeah, I mean, took over, or that this was a process in which the emergence since the end of the Second World War began in the making of what President Eisenhower, in his farewell address, warned the American people in 1961, his farewell address about the military-industrial complex. In fact, that speech is vital for anybody who wants to understand contemporary American politics and history to go back and read it, because he devoted his entire 10 minutes of farewell address on the effects of the military-industrial complex on the domestic life, constitutional order of the American Republic.
To be fair to Eisenhower, though, he said that we need a military-industrial complex. No longer can we turn plowshares into swords when we find ourselves invaded. We need to be ready. And I would agree with that. Of course you need to be ready at a moment's notice, because technology has taken over the world in such a respect that you can have a war beginning and ending in a day, or at least maybe 6 days. And so I agree with the premise of a military-industrial complex, having a war machine ready to defend a free nation.
Well, that's the debate. I mean, President Eisenhower was not somebody, who was not only not familiar with the military organ, he was a military man. In a sense, in the modern American history, he, in effect, was the greatest general, 5-star general, the supreme commander of the Allied forces that won the Second World War in Europe. So it was not somebody like Bill Clinton, who was running away from his draft in Vietnam, or Al Gore, or any one of the presidents that came after George Herbert Walker Bush, 41, who was president of that generation that participated in the war in which Eisenhower was the supreme commander. So for Eisenhower to lay down, it was not something that he was saying frivolously, because he was pointing out that every dollar taken out of the American economy to build an American fighter plane is taken away from children who need schools, and veterans who need hospital, and so on and so forth.
Trump as well. I mentioned Trump in that, but I think that he is different as well. Like you say, that Eisenhower and Kennedy are not a part of the neocon agenda, and I agree to that. But Trump as well. As a matter of fact, it has been said that the neocons were the ones behind the defeat of Trump, because he wanted to get out of Afghanistan, he wanted to get out of Syria, he wanted to get out of these engagements and to bring America back to its roots, which I would say that pre-1896 and the progressive movement of that year and subsequent, America was very much, live and let live. The world has its problems, but we're a free nation and we're going to take care of our own. And all of a sudden in 1896, and then again, just shortly after that, we get into the Spanish-American War, which people said, this is un-American. We don't go into the Philippines. We don't go into Cuba. What's all this about? This is not the United States that we have loved for the last 120 years. So the America that is at the pinnacle or in the mind of the neocons is not the America of 1776 or the America of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. It's the America of expansionism, of empire. And I think people should make that distinction. Like, we're criticizing America here in this discussion, but that doesn't mean I'm anti-American.
No, you're absolutely right. That's why I was suggesting or indicating that we really need to have that broader discussion, because there is so much to engage in that matter. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I was going to point out that President Trump, was in fact in a headlong conflict with the neocon position, and in fact, his presidency, his 4 years in office, was a reversal of everything about the neocon position, or most of it, if not everything, most of it, and that the return of the Democrats into the White House with Biden, however it happened, was the return of the neocons. So it is something that is absolutely contemporary and present, but it has a history, right? And a history is very complex, and one has to go into it. But coming back to the Ukraine issue about the neocon, it begins with, and what you're referring to is the policy paper, the neocon policy paper that was prepared immediately after the end of the Cold War and submitted to the Clinton administration. I have it right on my hand. That is Rebuilding America's Defenses. And it is what is called a report, the project for the new American century. So let's briefly talk about that. I won't take too much time. We can come back and talk about it in greater detail. The project for New American Century is the neocon document that was prepared as the Cold War came to an end. And here, again, to put it very quickly in a nutshell, the Cold War came to an end gradually, beginning with the bringing down of the Berlin Wall, the Solidarity Revolution in Poland, which Gorbachev did not intervene to crush it, as it happened earlier with the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in 1968-69, or Hungary in 1956, and so on. That in Poland, the Solidarity movement was, allowed to carry on, even though there was a martial law brought about by the Polish president Jaruzelski. But solidarity ultimately prevailed. And then came the Berlin Wall, and then came subsequently 2 years later, in 1991, the internal uprising in Russia or the Soviet Union, the attack upon the Soviet version of the White House in Moscow, and the collapse, the complete disintegration of Soviet Union in December of 1991, with Boris Yeltsin emerging as the president. So it was a graduated process that happened, spread out at least over several years. So people were expecting it, in a sense, nobody predicted it, but it happened under the watch of, began with President Reagan and accelerated through the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush in that period. After Reagan, and you have this document being prepared, but the expectation for the American people, the European people, that is people around the world, was the end of the Cold War will bring peace dividend. It will be the end of this almost half a century of living at the razor's edge of a confrontation between Soviet Union and United States that had every possibility of escalating towards a nuclear confrontation, a nuclear exchange. We lived in a world that was, by its acronym, called MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction, and that was the temper of the time that people have forgotten. Those of us who were raised in that period. I was in undergraduate school in late 70s and early 80s, and this was the predominant issue in the minds of everybody, all intellectual, media, academics, and so on. And so the peace dividend will come. And guess what? The neocon prepared this document and slips it into the hands of the Bill Clinton administration that comes in 1992. It's about rebuilding America's defense, expanding furthermore. Today, America's defense expenditure, according to the latest reports of the Stockholm Institute of Peace Research, is an astronomical $1.5 trillion, taking into account inflation. $1.5 trillion, and the rest of the world spend, including Russia and China, spend less than what America spends. There's 190 plus country spends less than $1.5 trillion, and America spends $1.5 trillion. That's the expenditure in the global arena behind the military. So in 1989, 1990, there was an expectation of peace dividend. And what happened? There was that unique moment in history with the collapse of the Soviet Union that America finds itself as the lone superpower. America is the dominant power, and this is the unipolar moment in history. One superpower straddling the globe, militarily, economically, and in every other way, it is a dominant power. And what is the neocon agenda? It is spelled out right in the policy paper. And it is the one sentence that captures the whole neocon agenda is this following sentence, if I may read it out. It's just one sentence. And of course, the whole thing is an explication of that sentence. It says, at present, that is the 1990s, at present, the United States faces no global rival. America's grand strategy should aim to preserve and extend this advantageous position as far into the future as possible.
Perpetual
That's
war.
what it is.
Trotskyism. Perpetual revolution.
Yeah. So this is it. I mean, the unipolar moment should be extended right across indefinitely into the future. Right. And that's what comes into effect. And from 1991, 1992, with the implementation in a gradual basis of rebuilding the military armed forces, cutting back upon some of the agreements that had been reached between America and Soviet Union during the Nixon administration, the Carter administration, going into the Reagan-Bush administration, that is the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the limitation, the SALT, strategic arm limitation talks, and so on, to cut back upon them. And in fact, the ABM treaty was on the table to be rejected by the Clintons, and then it was done so by Bush 43. This is the further humiliation of Russia, in the sense that Russia was now going to be pushed right into the corner. But to expand and build the American, for the new American century, the unipolar moment to be extended in depth, you need an enemy. And the enemy would be Russia,
And comparing Russia or not having Russia as the enemy, they chose other little countries around the world to sharpen their skills and hone their soldiers. Syria, Iraq, it doesn't matter where it was in the world. They wanted to make sure that their weapons were tested, their soldiers were kept at their peak efficiency and prowess. And so now we have Russia, and I think the neocons are chomping at the bit here just to get involved in this in a big way.
Exactly. So the 1990s was the buildup of the neocon agenda. Russia was the eventual target in the sense that Russia had to be eliminated because Russia is the other military power. Economically, it has been destroyed or broken down. Politically, it's broken down. There's no more Soviet Union, but still it has military power. It's still a nuclear power country. And Russia has to be brought to its knees, if possible, broken up, so that the globalist agenda can be imposed upon the rest of the world.
It's such a shame, Salim. It's such a shame because historically, and you and I have had good discussions over this in the past, historically, Russia was a good neighbor. He was an ally of the United States. The United States would not exist in its present form if it wasn't for Tsar Alexander II. You know, they've been allies with the West, well, as a Soviet Union. Now, mind you, the Soviet Union was one hell of an evil empire, but they were our allies in World War I, World War II. You know, so to destroy Russia utterly is contrary to our historic relations with that nation.
Yeah, so it is. I mean, once, as you have just now frame your observation about that historical relationship between Russia and America that predates the 20th century history in that sense, particularly the history after the Cold War, in which the neocon agenda is to keep Russia as the enemy so that their globalist agenda can be pushed forward. And we can see, I mean, this is not speculation, we can see the graduated process by which this Ukraine war is a proxy war that was is being brought to bear, the neocons agenda to humiliate Russia, to bring it down, and so that the globalist agenda through the platform of NATO and the EU with the World Economic Forum can then be imposed upon the rest of the world. But if we take again, and this is where one would hope, in the best sense of the word, that the media would be the instrument of educating the public by providing these different perspective and different voices and different understanding, so the public can be informed that a particular narrative has a particular agenda. This narrative to present Russia as an enemy has a particular agenda, just as the agenda after 9/11 was to paint all Muslims and all of Islam as the enemy, was an agenda, as if, 2 billion people almost now, Muslims around the world. I am a Muslim, coming, my family from India. India is the world's largest democracy, and it is also second largest Muslim population in the world, that we're all the enemies of the West, or we are all irrational people, and so, but we are horned devils. But that is what exactly the media narrative was, and that narrative has continued in so many different ways. So the terrible tragedy of our time, is how the media, instead of serving the people by educating them through the multitudinous voices that exist, that gives the complexity of the world. And in this crowded world, we need to understand each other instead of vilifying each other. That is what has happened. And Russia is now the vilification. But if you step back, as you point out, there is another narrative. And the narrative there, you mentioned the name Tsar Alexander III. We're going back to 19th century, 19th century when America was a very young country, relatively speaking, we're talking about. And if you go back and we pause and we take a look, a strikingly different picture emerged. And that picture is, in one sense, best conveyed by this French writer, author, aristocrat, who served in the French Assembly, Parliament, in the period 1840s, who became the French foreign minister, and a counterpart to the British foreign minister in the 19th century, the most famous British foreign minister, Lord Palmerston. This man, who wrote possibly the greatest or the best book on America, is Alexis de Tocqueville, and his book, Democracy in America. Tocqueville was born in 1805, and in the midst of the Napoleonic era. He was a young man or a young boy when Napoleon was defeated in the Battle of Waterloo, and that phase of history came to an end. The French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and it came to an end. And then he as a young man traveled to America in the I think he arrived in America in 1830, 1831, and he spent almost a year in America, and then he returned to France, and he published the first volume of his book, Democracy in America, in 1835, and the second volume was published in 1840. And this is a book, the Democracy in America, that needs to be read and reread to understand, at least to go back to understand what was the promise of America that so charmed and overwhelmed Alexis de Tocqueville, a child and born in an aristocratic family, growing up in the Revolutionary period and the Napoleonic War, but came to America, looked at America, and wrote about America in so many different ways that unravel the soul of America and the American people and what is democracy. And in the end of the first volume, 1835, the final paragraphs of that volume, he turns around and he looks at the world that is his world, the world in which he was playing a role, and speculates what he sees. And what he sees is these two continental powers. One he has visited and has come back and written about it, and the other with which France is engaged with, that Napoleon the paradox and the irony, ultimate defeat was brought about by invading Russia. But Tocqueville, sees the emergence of these two continental powers. One, United States, with its manifest destiny, moving across the continent westward towards the Pacific Ocean. The other continental power, Russia, in its own version of manifest destiny, moving across the continent, that is Eurasia, to the Pacific Ocean. And if I may, I would like to read the concluding paragraph. It is astounding paragraph. The neocons haven't read it, apparently, or the neocons don't want to read it, or the neocons want to go contrary to what Tocqueville was talking about or imagining. And this is how he says, if you bear with me, I won't read the whole several passages, but I just want to pick up a couple of sentences where he gets into this concluding section of his volume 1. He says, a time will arrive when one can see 150 million men in North America. Well, now we are in America, 340 plus million people. 150 million men in North America, equal among themselves, who all belong to the same family, who have the same point of departure, the same civilization, the same language, the same religion, the same habits, the same mores, and through whom thought will circulate in the same form and be painted in the same color. And then he goes on to say, There are two great peoples on the earth today who, starting from different points, seem to advance toward the same goal. These are the Russians and the Anglo-Americans, Anglo in the sense of English speaking. And he goes on defining them in lengthy paragraph, but this is how he ends. There, that is American and Russian, their point of departure is different. Their ways are diverse. Nonetheless, each of them seem called by a secret design of providence to hold the destinies of half the world in his hands one day. Destinies, either of peace or of war. Obviously, Alexei is not wishing war. Destiny is in terms of peace, you know. And as a Frenchman, he has seen the immense power in terms of stamina, resolve, determination, and capacity to withstand whatever is thrown against them and eventually prevail. And that is the Napoleonic Wars. And if we then advance after Tocqueville, the same thing we saw in the Second World War. But in between the Second World War and the Napoleonic Wars, in which Russia defeated Napoleon and Russia defeated the Germans and advanced towards the center of Europe as a result of those two wars that was imposed upon Russia, there is the other story. Tocqueville was alive when the Crimean War took place in 1854-56. He had just stepped down from being French foreign minister. And the Crimean War was a war that resulted because of Britain and France coming into an alliance with the Ottoman Turkish Empire, Ottoman Empire, to fend off the Russian. The Russians under Tsar Alexander II had stepped forward. They were pushing south. These are empires. We are in the time of empires, and Russia is a land empire, and Ottoman Empire is a land empire. And Russia was pushing southwards as it was pushing eastward towards the Pacific, and it was pushing against the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire controlled the area around the Black Sea and into what is modern day the Balkan states of Serbia, Romania, Hungary, and so on. These were all part of the Ottoman Empire. But these were Christian people. They were Orthodox Christian, especially the people in Hungary, Hungary and Serbia. And there was an internal conflict within the Ottoman Empire between Christians and Muslims over Constantinople, which was historically the capital of the Orthodox Christianity that the Turks had conquered going back to the 15th century. And Russia, as now, in a sense, Moscow, the third Rome, and the Emperor of Russia and the Patriarch of Moscow representing Orthodox Christianity, was coming to the defense of the Orthodox Christians in the Balkans over Constantinople. And Britain and France instead joined with the Ottomans to fight the Russians in the Crimean War. Okay, so the Crimean War came to a stalemate. Russia sued for peace. It was being defeated in Crimea. They sued for peace. And peace treaty was imposed in a conference in Berlin. But simultaneously, or a few years later, almost coming one after the other, the American Civil War broke out, 1861. President Lincoln in power, the Civil War, the Union and the Confederacy, the slave state, And here you have Britain and France again. Tocqueville is dead and gone by now. You have Britain and France again supporting the slave states, the Confederate powers, against the Union. There is the British North America. Canada has still not come together as a dominion. So the provinces of Canada, Upper and Lower Canada, and the Maritime is British North America. The British are present in North America in that sense. Halifax is the naval base of the British fleet in North America. And the French and the British are in support of the Confederacy against the Union. And so Alexander II sends the Russian fleet to New York. He sends his Baltic fleet to New York, and he sends his Pacific fleet to California. And historians now, close to 150 years later, have different arguments about it, whether Tsar Alexander did this basically to save his fleet from the British and the French if they would block the fleets off in the Baltic during the winter months, or whether he did it with the purpose of coming to the support of the Americans, that is the Union, and President Lincoln against the Confederacy, the slave states, which the British and the French were supporting, by mounting a blockade of the Union ports on the Atlantic coast and cutting off the Union trade with the rest of the world, but in particular with Europe. So the Russian fleets arrive in New York. Whatever may be the various historical views upon this matter, none of the historians in this internal debate deny the fact that President Lincoln and his Secretary of State, William Seward, greeted the arrival of the Russian fleet in New York with all the pomp and ceremony deserving to Russia. They greeted the fleet, they greeted the admirals who came with the fleet. There were massive balls that were held in New York City. President Lincoln gave a massive feast to the visiting officers. Flags were raised both on the East Coast and the West Coast. And the positioning of the fleet, the Russian fleet, was deliberate. It was positioned in New York and going up and down the coast, given the fact that the British fleet is in Halifax. So the long and the short of it is that the most vulnerable and trying moment of the American Republic, when the American Republic was on the edge of possibly breaking apart, but for Abraham Lincoln's determination to hold it together and fight the Civil War, the Russian fleet played a role. It deterred the British and the French fleet from intervening in raising the blockade on the Union ports. And this is recognized and was recognized by the Lincoln administration and the subsequent administration. Now, both, just to conclude this chapter in history, which people have forgotten, both Lincoln and Tsar Alexander II, in their own respective ways, were emancipators. In the midst of the Civil War, Lincoln signed a proclamation of emancipation of the slaves, and that famous speech that he gave at Gettysburg after the Gettysburg battle. And then he gets assassinated in 1865. And there are stories and ruminations and reflection to the extent that the British had a hand in the assassination of Lincoln through various agencies and agents based out of Montreal. So there you have it. Canada, in that sense, was a participant in a negative way in the war, even though there's the other story that there was the underground railway, in the sense, escape route for the blacks coming into British North America, particularly in the Maritimes. So you have a black population that goes back to it. Now we have that on our $10 bill, of the woman. I forget her name right now. So there is this paradoxical position of the British North America. But President Lincoln was an emancipator in that sense. And his counterpart, Tsar Alexander II, was an emancipator. He emancipated the serfs of Russia, and he was assassinated too in 1881. Both the men, Lincoln and Tsar Alexander. But Tsar Alexander, before he died, he negotiated, that is, his people negotiated the sale of the Russian province of Alaska. That is the great advance that Tocqueville was writing about, the sale of Alaska to the Americans for $7 million. And in a way, positioned or helped America position itself far north in the North American continent with territory that would again block off the British. And it is no wonder that there was this rapid movement that took place among the elite in Canada, led by people like Johnny MacDonald, George Cartier, and others, George Brown, etc., to bring together the British North America into a consolidated position as soon as the Civil War ended, to create the Dominion in 1867, the Dominion that was brought about. So that story is not discussed today, or it has gone down into the black hole of memory. But what that story tells us, that there is no permanent enemies, which is what the neocon would like to have people see Russia as the permanent enemy. There's this Putin as the reincarnated Hitler or Stalin. What it is that the end of the Cold War opened a new chapter in history. And that new chapter is, particularly for the Russians, on the Russian side, which is what the Americans and the neocons have given no credence or have not paid any, serious consideration. That is, the collapse of the Soviet Union opens the chapter that got short-circuited with not only the assassination of Tsar Alexander III, but the weakness of his grandson, Nicholas II, the last Romanov Tsar, the dynasty that got overthrown with the Bolshevik Revolution. In between, there was that Russia was making a transition to the long-awaited opening, initially, of a democratic state, the making of an independent parliament. The parliament was made, an independent parliament was brought about after the 1905 revolution in Russia, which failed following the Russo-Japanese War. But in 1905, the Duma was established. A prime minister was appointed, Pyotr Stolypin. And Pyotr Stolypin, as people who are familiar with this part of Russian history, was an absolutely admirable human being, a charismatic, powerful, knowledgeable, determined human being, contrary to his Tsar Nicholas II, who was a very weak person and turned out to be a weak person. But he was pushing ahead with the reforming of Russia, with the modernizing of Russia, because the template had been created with the emancipation of the serfs by Tsar Alexander II. And what happens is Pyotr Stolypin, just as the Tsar Alexander II was killed by anarchists and terrorists, Nicholas II, Pierre Stolypin was killed in 1915, I think it was, or 1914, but just about the time of the outbreak of the World War I, was killed by the terrorists. And that strong hand in Moscow was gone with Tsar as a weak hand. The people who replaced him were not up to the task. And then the Bolshevik Revolution happens. And so that history then spread across the 20th century is the short circuiting of the promise and the possibilities that Tocqueville, in his mind, has seen as a possibility, that a republic based upon a constitution that champions the issue of freedom, liberty, and democracy as equality, and people as sovereign, would be matched by a similar possible advancement over time of Russia, as Russia was emerging as the powerhouse in Europe in terms of its shadow falling across the rest of Europe, that is Western Europe. The history of Europe has been the question of who would be the dominant power. Whether it would be France, that was the Napoleonic Wars, that was the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, or would it be Germany, with the coming together of Prussia under Bismarck and the making of modern Germany under Prussian influence and Prussian control, and would Germany dominate? And the history of the 20th century as a lost cause of freedom in that sense is the history of the madness of Europeans that led to two world wars that embroiled the rest of the world. And then it led to the Cold War, But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, a new page opened. And the new page is, would Russia be able to make the transition from an authoritarian, totalitarian system that had been the Bolshevik Revolution, which is, of course, also connected to the Jacobin. The Bolsheviks are Jacobin of the French Revolution. France made the transition. Would Russia make the transition? Well, that is the agenda was of Gorbachev, Glasnost and Perestroika, but within the framework of Marxism. Gorbachev did not renounce Marxism, that is Bolshevism, but he wanted to open up Russia. He wanted to bring about some fundamental change. But the collapse of Russia then pushed that history into the trash can and the possibility of that transition. Well, Putin is trying to make that transition. Putin cannot be, by any consideration, in my view, be painted as a Hitler or a Stalin. If anything, Putin can be referred to in this historical transition as the Russian version of, say, Deng Xiaoping, as Deng Xiaoping opened up China's economy after Mao. But China has not taken the next step into going into the beginning of a multi-party parliamentary democracy. Well, that's what Putin has been doing. There is a constitutional order put together. A Russian constitution has been passed. The Russian Duma has been brought into effect, not by Putin, but it came with Boris Yeltsin. And there has been regular elections that have been held. And Duma is a multi-party platform where there are communists, but there are also liberals and people who are nationalists or Mother Russia people, as is Putin. And Putin has been elected by the Russian people to the presidency. So that transition was in process and is in process. That transition has not been reversed. So this war in Ukraine has less to do with the narrative that Putin is the Hitler and Stalin trying to recreate the Soviet Union, and more to do, in fact, all of it to do, I would argue, with the neocon project of leveling down any opposition. And the biggest opposition in the 20th century, 21st century that they knew, and that's why the demonization of Russia that has continued with the neocon agenda. My final thought on this matter is something which was on the table. It was on the table with George Kennan. It was on the table with Jean Kirkpatrick. It's been on the table with others who participated in the making of the strategy of containment, who served President Carter, President Reagan, President Bush during the Cold War years, people like James Matlock and others, that NATO rationale, raison d'etre, ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union. NATO was formed to contain the Soviet Union in 1949, and that raison d'etre ended, and NATO should have been dismantled after 1991, just as the Warsaw Pact country, which was a tit for tat to NATO, which Moscow organized with the East European country that was under the control of the Soviet army, and to which Churchill referred to as the Iron Chain that has come down from the Baltics to the Adriatic. So those Warsaw Pact countries, Poland, Hungary, Romania, were brought together under the Warsaw Pact in 1955. And with the collapse and disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, Warsaw Pact countries were dismantled. There is no Warsaw Pact. But so the question then becomes, what is NATO? Why is NATO 30 years on after the fall of Soviet Union? What is the purpose of NATO?
It seems to be an organization in search of an enemy.
Precisely.
And I think it's found one, or it's creating one, isn't it?
Well, what I was going to point out, that very recently, about 2-3 weeks ago, in a conference in Europe, the Foreign Secretary of Britain, Liz Truss, she called for expansion of NATO all the way to the Pacific, countries that want to join it, to contain China and oppose or defend Taiwan. So in effect, the people who are pushing NATO, that is the neocon agenda, they want NATO and EU in that sense. EU is no longer sovereign. It is simply another instrument for Washington to be the alternative platform, the platform for the globalists and the rule-based order to what the UN Charter represents. We might have difficulties with the UN Charter, with some of its program and some of its issues, but it is the platform that exists as a result of all the countries participating in it as independent sovereign state. Whereas NATO and EU pushing the globalist agenda would be simply the neocon version of what they want the world to be. And that is the great contradiction or the great conflict of our time, which should not have happened, but is happening, is what Putin referred to in your opening remark, between a monopolar or unipolar world and the restoration of a multipolar world. And the vote of the people, I believe, that is through their representative in the countries, as is with the BRIC countries, is for restoring and strengthening the multipolar world, rather than making a transition backwards into a unipolar world, which in other words would be simply an American empire.
Fascinating history, Celine. Thank you for bringing it to our attention, because you're not going to get it anywhere else, perhaps not even in the universities. And if you do, I think it will be tainted in one direction. So let's leave it there and join up again to discuss the events as they unfold in Ukraine and the world, and get your unique perspective on it. Thank you very much, Celine.
Thank you.